What if I told you there's an ancient writing system that once covered Northern Europe, filled with secrets, power, and stories lost to time? A script carved into weapons, whispered in spells, and set in stone by Viking kings. A script that disappeared, yet still lingers all around us today. From fantasy films to tech logos, from tattoos to secret codes, are we witnessing the rebirth of runes in modern times? But before we answer that, let's go back, way back, to where runes began. If you love history, language, and discovering hidden meanings, hit subscribe and join the adventure. Let's answer the simplest question. What is a rune? A rune isn't just a symbol. It's a letter, part of an alphabet used by early Germanic peoples before the Latin alphabet took over. But unlike our modern letters, runes carried extra weight. Some were seen as having magical or protective properties. Even the word rune itself has a mystery behind it. It comes from Proto-Germanic runo, meaning secret or whisper. Why? Was writing considered sacred? Were runes used for hidden knowledge? Hold that thought, because we'll come back to it later. Now, where did runes actually come from? The first confirmed runic inscription dates to 160 CE, found in Denmark. But were runes invented there? Some scholars argue they evolved from old Italic alphabets, like Etruscan or Latin, adapted by Germanic tribes, whilst others believed Celtic influence played a role in shaping them. But it's important to remember that language rarely evolves in isolation. Cultures interact, trade, and influence one another, meaning writing systems, just like spoken language, are often fluid, blending and adapting over time, rather than forming in a vacuum. What's certain is that runes didn't appear out of thin air. They were inspired by writing systems that had already existed in Europe for centuries. Notice how runes are straight, angular lines. There's a simple reason. They were carved, not written in ink. Straight lines were easier to carve into wood, bone, or metal, perfect for the tools of the time. But if runes were so useful, why did they change? And why did they disappear? The earliest runic alphabet we know of is the Elder Futhark, used from around 160 CE to 700 CE. It has 24 runes, divided into 3 groups of 8, called Aittir. The first 6 letters spelled Futhark, which is why we call it Futhark rather than an alphabet. Around 700 CE, something unexpected happened. Instead of expanding with use, Scandinavians cut their alphabet down from 24 letters to just 16. Why? Some believe it made carving faster, fewer symbols, fewer strokes. Others argue that by this time, people relied more on context than precise spelling, making some distinctions between sounds unnecessary. But whatever the reason, this change made reading runes much harder. In the Elder Futhark, each sound had its own distinct rune, but in its new reduced form, the Younger Futhark, multiple sounds were collapsed into a single rune. For example, the rune Cone now represented K, G, and NG, 3 completely different sounds. The same thing happened with other letters too, forcing people to guess based on context. This wasn't just a simplification, it was a fundamental shift in how runes worked. Meanwhile, across the sea in England, runes were taking a very different path. While Scandinavians were simplifying their writing system, the Anglo-Saxon runic alphabet was expanding, so much so that it eventually became distinct enough to warrant a new name. Futhark became Futhorc. The Anglo-Frisian Futhorc, used in England and Frisia from around 400 CE to 1100 CE, was doing the exact opposite of what was happening in Scandinavia. Instead of shrinking, it was growing, adapting to the complex sounds of Old English. The Futhorc expanded to 34 runes, adding new letters to match sounds that didn't exist in the earlier Elder Futhark. Unlike the Scandinavian runes, which remained primarily carved into wood and stone, Futhorc was even written in manuscripts, blending with the Latin script as Old English literacy grew. This divergence marks one of the most fascinating shifts in runic history, one system simplifying to the point of ambiguity, while the other evolved for greater precision. Of course, the story of language in Britain is a tangled one, shaped by invasion, trade, and shifting power. When the Romans arrived in Britain, they brought Latin with them. But outside of Roman soldiers, officials, and administration, most Britons stuck to their Celtic language. Latin never truly replaced them. And when the Romans withdrew around 400 CE, Latin's influence in Britain rapidly waned. However, across much of mainland Europe, Latin was strong and retained enormous prestige, especially in law, religion, and scholarship. That prestige gradually seeped back into Britain. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Latin was back in force, the language of the church, law, and record-keeping. In a sense, Latin didn't just conquer through military might. It conquered with ink and parchment too. Celtic languages and the Anglo-Saxon runes may have remained in many rural areas and among certain communities, from memorial stones to personal belongings, blending Germanic tradition with a new English identity. But by the High Middle Ages, the fate was sealed. The written word belonged to Latin, and the runes became whispers from a fading past. But they didn't vanish overnight. Instead, they transformed one last time. In medieval Scandinavia, runes made a comeback, adapting once again to the evolving language. To fix the ambiguities of younger Futhark, new dotted variations were introduced, allowing writers to distinguish between sounds that had previously been lumped together. Yet, even as Latin script dominated official records, runes held on, especially in everyday writing. In fact, in some rural parts of Sweden, people were still using them well into the 1800s. The story of runes should have ended there, but as we'll see, their legacy was far from over. We've seen how runes evolved, but what did people actually use them for? And why did so many believe they were magical? Some runes were carved as protective symbols, like the word alu, which might mean ale, a blessing, a charm, or even a spell. Ale wasn't just a drink in the ancient world. It was tied to feasting, ritual, and offerings to the gods. Or was alu something more? A whispered invocation, a mark of power. We still don't know for sure. And then there's Odin, the ultimate seeker of wisdom. In Norse mythology, he sacrificed himself, hanging from Yggdrasil for 9 nights, to unlock the power of runes, not just as a form of writing, but as something far greater, a divine source of knowledge, a bridge between the physical and the mystical. But what about everyday life? Not every rune inscription speaks of gods or magic. Many were just well, practical. Marking names on belongings, recording deals, or even tavern graffiti. Yet, like any alphabet, runes hold power, even when not everyone understands it. Symbols carry meaning, shaped by those who use them. Whether you see runes like tarot, a mystical force revealing hidden truths, or as a tool of intention, prayer, or spellcasting, their ancient use and continued evolution make them powerful. Some believe they guide us, drawing out knowledge we already hold deep within, while others see them as a mirror of human history and expression. But whichever side of the fence you sit, one thing is certain: runes have never been just marks on stone. They've always carried something more. In Bergen, Norway, a massive find of wooden rune carvings revealed something unexpected: runic graffiti. Some say Ave Maria, some declare love, and one scolds someone for drinking too much at the tavern. So, were runes magical or just practical? The answer might well be both. The runes that had once carved their way across northern Europe were fading. Christianity was spreading. Monasteries were producing beautifully illustrated manuscripts, and runes were left behind. Or at least, that's how the story is often told. But like any script, runes didn't just disappear overnight. They adapted, lingered in everyday inscriptions, and in some cases outright refused to die. Take the letter Thorn, for example. If you've ever seen old texts with an unusual-looking "the," that's actually a variant of the Thorn rune, hanging on, hidden in plain sight, until the printing press swapped it out for TH. And we've already found that runes were a common practice still in Sweden in the 1800s. But then, in the 20th century, something far darker happened. Runes were misused, twisted from their origins. The Sovilo rune, once a symbol of the sun, was appropriated by the Nazis, becoming the infamous SS insignia. Other runes were distorted into symbols of hate, stripping them of their rich linguistic and cultural history. Even today, some people hesitate to use runes, not realizing they existed for over 1,000 years before they were corrupted in a handful of decades. But history isn't static, and many groups are reclaiming runes, refusing to let them be defined by one dark chapter. And then there's Tolkien, the man who single-handedly brought runes back into the public imagination. His dwarvish runes, inspired by Anglo-Saxon Futhorc. The fact that fantasy fans today associate runes more with Middle-earth than medieval Europe, well, that's the power of storytelling. But it didn't stop there. The Bluetooth logo? That's literally two runes, Hagal and Bjarkan, the initials of Harald Bluetooth, the Viking king who united Denmark. Runes pop up in video games, tattoos, book covers, and movies. Even if they're not always historically accurate, they're undeniably part of modern culture. So where do we go from here? Runes have evolved before, simplified, adapted, reworked, and now they're evolving again. Some argue that this is their next natural step, that runes, like any part of language, are meant to change and grow. Others feel we should be careful, ensuring that modern adaptations don't erase their true history. It's the same debate that follows every ancient symbol, every old language. Where do we draw the line between tradition and reinvention? Fact and fiction often blur, and maybe, just maybe, that's the magic of runes. Their power is shaped by those who use them. So what do you think? Should runes be revived, reinvented, or simply remembered. Let us know in the comments, and if you love stories like these, please do subscribe, like, and hit the notifications bell, because every word has a story, and this one is still being written.